Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're heading way back past kings, castles, and even the invention of bread to a time when Europe was in tea, filled with cozy villages or Gothic cathedrals, but glaciers, mammoths, and some very weird-looking people called Neanderthals. So, grab a blanket, settle in, and let your mind drift a few tens of thousands of years into the past. It's cold, it's quiet, and somewhere out there, in a cave filled with smoke and bone dust, humanity's first real cousins are grunting their way through another ice age. Now, before we get to cozy, let's be clear, Neanderthals weren't dumb brutes. They weren't half-naked cavemen dragging clubs around. That's just how 19th century scientists liked to imagine them, probably because they were projecting a little too much. In reality, these people were absolute freaks of nature in the best possible way. Short, wide, muscled like Olympic powerlifters, and probably capable of wrestling a bear if they felt like it. But they weren't just muscle. These folks had big brains, actually bigger than ours. Their skulls were longer, their faces jutted out more, and they had these heavy brows that made them look permanently skeptical. Which is fair, given that the Ice Age was probably not the ideal time to exist. Let's start there. Picture Europe about 100,000 years ago. Forget rolling green fields. Think frozen tundra, sharp winds, endless snow, and the occasional herd of woolly mammoths lumbering by. If you didn't freeze to death or get eaten by a cave lion, congratulations, you were doing great. And yet, in this miserable setting, Neanderthals thrived for hundreds of thousands of years. They hunted giant animals with nothing but wooden spears. They made tools so sharp they could butcher a mammoth in minutes. They even buried their dead because, of course, they did. And they did it long before we ever showed up to judge them. But what's fascinating is how different they were. Their bodies were like survival tanks, wide rib cages, thick bones, and limbs that looked carved out of granite. A modern human next to a Neanderthal looked like an office intern standing beside a rugby player. You can imagine how that went when they eventually met. Now, before we get to that awkward human-Neanderthal encounter, let's float for a bit in their daily world. Their homes, if you could call them that, were caves or temporary shelters made of bones and hides. Fires flickered against stone walls, lighting up rough paintings, tool piles, and maybe the remains of last night's dinner. It wasn't glamorous, but it was home. They had family groups, small ones, maybe 20 or 30 individuals, and they stuck together. Life was brutal, short, and mostly about not dying, but they still cared for one another. Archaeologists have found skeletons of Neanderthals who lived for years after suffering major injuries. Someone had to feed and protect them. That's empathy. And empathy, as it turns out, isn't just a human thing. Let's talk about diet, because, well, it's another area where they were just different. If a paleo-influencer says they're eating like a caveman, they're lying. Neanderthals weren't eating acai bowls and grilled salmon. Their meals were basically slabs of meat, reindeer, bison, maybe a little mammoth tartare if the hunt went well. They were apex predators, with the bone chemistry to prove it, but they weren't all steak and mammoth fat. Some Neanderthal sites show traces of cooked plants, nuts, even herbs, which means, yes, they seasoned their food. They didn't have TikTok, but they did have taste. Now, let's pause on their brains. Because the Neanderthal brain was about 10% larger than ours, yet somehow, they didn't end up inventing smartphones or building empires. Bigger didn't mean better, it meant different. Their brains were more specialized for vision, movement, and body control. In short, they were built for survival, not civilization. Imagine being a Neanderthal, waking up each morning. You stretch, you grunt, you pick up your trusty flint blade, and you go hunt something the size of a small truck. No taxes, no rent, just the ongoing struggle to not freeze or starve. Simple times. And yet, there was art in that life. They painted caves with red ochre, war beads made of shells, and collected shiny stones for no practical reasons, because they liked them. That's not primitive, that's human. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Around 60,000 years ago, something started stirring far to the south. Another kind of human, our kind, was moving north from Africa. And while Neanderthals had been ruling Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, we were about to crash their Ice Age party. You can almost imagine the first meeting, a small group of Neanderthals out hunting in the snowy steppe, when suddenly, these lanky strangers show up. They're thinner, weaker looking, maybe even smell weird, but they have new tools. blows, blades, strange ornaments. The Neanderthals probably squinted, grunted something like "who invited these guys," and went back to business. But of course, curiosity took over, and eventually, well, things got a little romantic. Geneticists have confirmed it. Modern humans and Neanderthals didn't just meet, they mingled. Today, almost everyone outside of Africa carries a few % of Neanderthal DNA. So if you've ever wondered why you re slightly better at handling cold weather, or maybe why you re a little grumpy before coffee, blame your Ice Age ancestors. Still, that mixing didn't end well for Neanderthals. As humans spread, their populations began to shrink. Climate change hit hard, animals moved away, and the newcomers started outcompeting them for food and territory. Within a few thousand years, Neanderthals were gone, or at least, mostly gone. A few traces of them live on in our genes, our bones, and maybe in our stubbornness. But we're not done yet, because before they disappeared, the Neanderthals left behind clues that challenge everything we thought we knew about intelligence, empathy, and evolution. They weren't beasts. They were something else, something uncomfortably close to us. So tonight, as we drift further into their frozen world, let's take a closer look at who they really were. Their families, their tools, their weird social lives, and how, in the end, their extinction became our inheritance. Let's wander back into the Ice Age, where firelight flickers on cave walls, and the line between us and them starts to blur. Welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations, you've made it through the mammoth hunts and the cold winds of Ice Age Europe. Let's sink a little deeper now, past the frost and the bones, into what life actually felt like for these people. The daily rhythm, the family drama, the quiet moments around a flickering fire. Because Neanderthals weren't just surviving, they were living in a world that was harsh. Yes, but also full of connection and strange beauty. Let's start with home. And by home, I mean caves, lots of caves. If you picture them as damp, dark holes, that's not entirely wrong. But they were also surprisingly cozy. Animal hides on the floor, a fire pit in the center, maybe some rocks stacked for sitting, smoke curling up toward the ceiling where soot stained the stone black. Archaeologists have found signs that they organized these spaces different zones for sleeping, cooking, and tool-making. So no, they weren't mindless wanderers. They had a sense of order. Even if their version of interior design involved mammoth bones instead of furniture, family life was everything. They traveled in small groups, maybe 20 people, sometimes less. Parents, kids, grandparents, all sticking close. The adults hunted, the women gathered plants, and the elders, those who managed to survive long enough, probably helped care for the children. And those children grew up fast. By age 10, they were already helping in hunts or crafting tools. Childhood wasn't really a thing yet. Life expected you to grow up the moment you could stand without falling over. But despite that, there was tenderness. We know because we've seen it in their bones. One famous skeleton, an old Neanderthal from Shanidar Cave in Iraq, had been badly injured, broken arm, crushed skull, missing an eye, and yet, he lived for years after. Someone must have cared for him, fed him, cleaned his wounds, kept him safe. That's compassion. And it's one of the earliest traces of real human empathy on record. Now, about their conversations or whatever passed for them, we used to think Neanderthals couldn't talk, that they just grunted at each other like frustrated gym brothers. But the bones don't lie. Their skulls had the right structures for speech. Their inner ears matched ours, and their DNA contained the same FOXP2 gene responsible for language. So yeah, they talked. Maybe not like us, but enough to share ideas, stories, or the occasional argument about who forgot the firewood. And speaking of arguments, you know there must have been some. Living in close quarters, freezing cold, with limited food. Someone's bound to get cranky. But they also cooperated because cooperation was survival. You didn't take down a mammoth alone. You worked as a group, with trust, coordination, and probably a few side eyes when someone messed up the plan. Now, let's drift into one of their most fascinating habits. Imagine this, a cave, cold and quiet, firelight flickering on the walls, a body laid carefully in a shallow pit, flowers or ochre scattered around. It's not a random pile of bones, it's a funeral. The Neanderthals were burying their dead long before our species arrived. That means they understood loss. They understood the finality of death. Maybe they even believed in something beyond it. We'll never know for sure, but the gesture alone says enough. And that brings us to one of the weirdest details of all: their emotional intelligence. For so long, people imagined them as emotionless survival machines, but their artifacts tell a different story. Shell necklaces, eagle talons, strung as ornaments, pigments used for body paint. They didn't just exist, they expressed. They saw beauty in things. That tiny spark of art, of creativity, is what makes them feel eerily familiar. Let's talk tools for a moment, because this is where Neanderthals truly shine. They weren't just chipping rocks together. They were making specialized tools, carefully shaped blades, scrapers, and spear points. They used a technique called Lavawa flaking, which sounds fancy because it is. You had to picture the shape of the final tool before you started striking the rock. It's like the prehistoric version of 3D printing, minus the electricity and the noise. Their spears were mostly for thrusting, not throwing, which meant hunting was personal. You had to get close to a 2,000-pound animal and stab it until it stopped moving. Imagine the courage, or maybe the recklessness, that took, and yet, they did it, repeatedly, for thousands of years. But even Neanderthals weren't all brawn. They also adapted. In some parts of Europe, as the climate changed and big animals disappeared, they started catching smaller prey. Rabbits, birds, fish. They shifted diets. They experimented. That's intelligence, not the kind that builds cities, but the kind that keeps you alive when the world is trying to kill you. Now, let's take a sleepy stroll into their evenings. After a day of hunting, gathering, and avoiding predators, the family would return to their shelter. Firelight flickers. Someone's roasting meat on the coals. The air smells like smoke and fat. Maybe a mother hums softly while cleaning a hide. The children play with stone flakes. The old ones sit back, quiet, watching the fire. For a brief moment, there's peace. And in that silence you can almost imagine them thinking not about survival, but about each other. And then, there's the strange fact that they lived like this for over 300,000 years. When modern humans started arriving from Africa, the Neanderthals were already feeling the squeeze. Climate was shifting. Glaciers were moving. Food was scarce. The newcomers brought new tools, new hunting strategies, and, apparently, irresistible charm, because the two groups didn't just fight. They also mixed. A lot. But that comes later. For now, let's just appreciate this ancient, forgotten rhythm of life. The quiet mornings in frozen valleys. The steady thud of stone on bone. The smoky nights under low ceilings of rock. The world was brutal, but they made it theirs. So, as the fire burns low and the wind howls outside the cave, we'll leave them here for a bit. These heavy-browed cousins of ours, half forgotten but never truly gone. Let's drift to the next part, where their world begins to change forever, where humans arrive in full force, and where the last of the Neanderthals start to fade into legend. So let's set the scene. It's around 60,000 years ago. The Ice Age is doing what it does best, being cold and miserable. In a valley somewhere between what's now the Middle East and Eastern Europe, a group of Neanderthals is tracking reindeer. The air smells like pine and snow. The ground is frozen solid. And just beyond the ridge, a band of strange, tall newcomers is moving in their direction. They're thinner, more upright, their faces smaller, their foreheads higher. They look different, move different. They speak in a language the Neanderthals don't recognize, and their tools sleek. Sharp blades of flint glint in the pale light. These are us, early modern humans. The last great experiment in the hominin family tree. At first, they probably ignored each other. Two bands of hunters sharing the same landscape, each hoping the other would just go away. But resources were scarce, and territory mattered. Eventually, paths crossed, and tension was inevitable. Except something unexpected happened. They didn't just compete, they connected. You see, our DNA tells a story that bones alone can't. Modern humans didn't just meet Neanderthals, they mingled with them. It wasn't a one-time event either. There were multiple encounters across thousands of years, scattered from the Middle East to Siberia, which means there wasn't just curiosity, there was familiarity. Let's be honest, we'll never know what those meetings looked like. Were they peaceful, violent, romantic? Probably all of the above. But however it happened, it left a mark that still exists in us. Today, almost everyone outside of Africa carries between 1 to 3% Neanderthal DNA. That's not a small souvenir. It's a genetic echo, passed down through tens of thousands of years. And what did we inherit from them? Quite a bit, actually. Some of our genes that help fight off infections. Neanderthal. certain skin tones and hair types, also Neanderthal. Even parts of our immune system came from them. Though, to be fair, so did some unfortunate things like allergies and a slightly higher risk of depression. So, thanks, cousins. But let us step back from the genetics for a moment and imagine this meeting on the ground. You're a Neanderthal hunter, walking through the snow. You see these newcomers using tools you've never seen before: bone needles, fish hooks, maybe even a bow. They travel farther, they hunt differently, and they seem to reproduce a lot. You're curious, maybe cautious, maybe envious. And then there's culture. The humans brought something strange and new: complexity. They carved figurines, painted scenes, wore ornaments that meant something. Neanderthals made jewelry too, but theirs was simpler, personal. The newcomers' art told stories. It was symbolic. It hinted at imagination, at belief. That difference may have changed everything. Humans began expanding across Europe faster than any species before them. They lived in larger groups, communicated better, and formed social networks that spanned miles. Neanderthals, meanwhile, lived in smaller, isolated communities. Fewer people meant fewer ideas, less innovation, and slower adaptation. And that's where things start to shift. The weather gets colder again, another ice age pulse. Food gets harder to find. The humans keep moving, adapting, sharing knowledge. The Neanderthals stay put, doing what's always worked. Except this time, it doesn't. We don't know if the humans outcompeted them directly, or if it was just bad timing. Probably both. But what's tragic and weirdly poetic is that it didn't happen overnight. The extinction of the Neanderthals wasn't a war. It was a fade. A long, quiet, vanishing act that took thousands of years. By around 40,000 years ago, the last Neanderthal groups were hanging on in the caves of southern Spain and Gibraltar. Imagine it, the last of their kind, tending fires on the edge of the world, watching herds move north, hearing the distant echoes of humans filling the continent. They must have known they were alone, and yet they didn't go without leaving traces. We've found their tools alongside ours, sometimes even mixed layers, proof that Neanderthals and humans shared the same spaces, maybe even learned from each other. There's a haunting beauty in that overlap. It's not just the end of a species. It's a moment when one kind of humanity quietly gave way to another. So, what made us survive and them disappear? Maybe it was numbers, maybe it was creativity, or maybe it was sheer luck. One big volcanic eruption, one harsh winter, one tiny shift in the environment, that's all it takes. Evolution doesn't care about fairness. Still, you can't help but feel for them. These were beings who laughed, loved, fought, and dreamed just like us. They had family bonds, they cared for their sick, they made art, and they adapted to a world that would have crushed most creatures. They just ran out of time. And in the end, they didn't really vanish. They're still here, part of our blood, part of our story. Every time you catch a glimpse of your reflection and notice something a little ancient in your face, or when you stand in the cold and feel oddly comfortable, that's them. The ghosts of a world we almost shared. So, as the Ice Age wind howls outside and our ancestors move on to claim the land, the Neanderthals fade back into the dark caves they called home. The fires go out, the bones are buried, and silence settles over the snow. Humanity has changed forever. But before we let them go completely, let us wander just a bit further, to the scientists and explorers who first dug them up and tried to piece together who they were. Because the way we rediscovered the Neanderthals says as much about us as it does about them. By now, the Neanderthals have vanished into the Ice Age fog, leaving behind only bones and whispers. Thousands of years pass, the glaciers melt, the world warms, and humans move on to invent farming, writing, and eventually, the internet. But the story of the Neanderthals wasn't over. It just went underground, literally. It all starts with a cave in Germany. The year is 1856, and a group of limestone miners are digging near Dusseldorf in a narrow valley called the Neander Valley. One day, they hit something strange in the rock. Not fossils of animals, not the usual rubble, but a handful of thick, heavy bones, a skull cap, a few ribs, a limb bone that looked wrong. They handed it over to a local teacher named Johann Karl Fulrat, who realized immediately that these weren't normal human remains. The bones were too thick, the brow ridge too big, the skull oddly shaped. Fulrat said they belonged to an ancient type of man, long extinct. Everyone else said he was nuts. You have to remember, this was 1856, 3 years before Darwin's Origin of Species. The idea of human evolution wasn't just controversial, it was borderline blasphemous. To most people, humanity was special, divine, unchanging. So when Fulrat suggested these bones belonged to an earlier form of human, people panicked a little. Enter Rudolf Virchow, a famous scientist of the day who wasn't buying any of it. He insisted the bones were from a modern human, just one who had suffered from rickets, arthritis, and a bad life. Basically, his argument was, he wasn't ancient, he was just unhealthy, and for decades, that's what people believed. The Neanderthal was written off as a weird medical case, but then more bones started turning up. In Belgium, France, Croatia, Spain, each discovery told the same story. These weren't sickly humans, they were something else, something older. Their skulls were long and low, their bodies thick and powerful. Slowly, the scientific world began to accept the idea that there had once been another kind of human walking the earth. The problem was, early scientists didn't exactly treat the Neanderthals with respect. Once Darwin's theory took off, people rushed to slot the Neanderthals into the missing link narrative. Artists drew them as hairy, stooping brutes with clubs in hand and vacant stares. They were portrayed as the ultimate cavemen, ugly, stupid, and conveniently extinct. It didn't help that the first reconstructions were, well, terrible. In 1908, French anatomist Marcellin Bull studied a nearly complete skeleton from La Chapelle aux Saints, but the poor individual he studied was an old Neanderthal with severe arthritis. Bull assumed that the hunched posture and bent knees were normal for the species, and so, the stereotype was born, the stooping, ape-like caveman. That image stuck around for nearly a century. Every schoolbook, every museum diorama, every movie caveman with a club and a gruntle came from that one misread skeleton. For decades, Neanderthals were the punchline of evolution, but science, thankfully, kept evolving. By the mid-20th century, new finds and better methods started to flip the story. The bones were re-examined, this time without the bias. Turns out, Neanderthals didn't walk like gorillas. They stood upright, their brains were bigger than ours, and far from being slow or dull, they were actually skilled hunters and toolmakers. Then came the real game-changer, DNA. In the 1990s, scientists managed to extract fragments of Neanderthal DNA from fossils, a mind-blowing achievement at the time. And when they compared it to ours, everything changed. We weren't separate species after all, we were family. That discovery cracked open a new chapter in understanding who we are. Because it wasn't just that Neanderthals looked like us or acted like us, they were part of us. Their genes still live inside modern humans, influencing everything from immune systems to hair color, to how our bodies handle cold. It turned out, the so-called primitive cavemen had quite literally shaped the modern world. Let's pause on that for a second. The same beings once dismissed as dumb brutes had made tools, buried their dead, maybe even painted caves, and eventually became part of the DNA of the species that would invent space travel and TikTok. Evolution has a sense of humor, but it wasn't just about genetics. As scientists started studying their living sites more closely, they began uncovering something even deeper: intelligence, complex thought, maybe even art. In Spain, red ochre markings on cave walls were dated to over 65,000 years ago, older than any known human. Art, that means Neanderthals, not modern humans, were the first artists. That one discovery flipped the script. The dumb caveman had been the first to make symbolic art, the first to leave a mark on the world just for the sake of beauty. And yet, even today, the image of the Neanderthal still struggles to shake off that old stereotype. It's hard to rewrite a story once it's been told for so long. For over a century, we used them as our evolutionary scapegoat, our way of saying, see, we're the smart ones. But the truth is messier. They were us, just ... differently shaped. You can almost feel the irony. The Neanderthals, once mocked as primitive, may have been more emotionally intelligent than we give them credit for. They cared for their sick, they buried their dead, they made things that didn't have to exist. Meanwhile, we're the ones who invented traffic jams and social media arguments. So as scientists keep digging, both literally and genetically, the story of the Neanderthals keeps getting softer, more human. What started as a tale of brute extinction is turning into something closer to a family history. The bones in the ground weren't just fossils. They were reminders that before we built cities, Before we split atoms, before we drew maps and borders, there was another kind of human who thrived in the dark and cold, who looked up at the stars and wondered what came next. And maybe, just maybe, they still whisper through us. Let's drift to our final part, where we'll explore what the Neanderthals truly left behind, their legacy, their lessons, and how their story changes how we see ourselves. We've followed the Neanderthals from their Ice Age caves to their rediscovery in the modern world. Tonight, in this last stretch, let's slow down and let their story sink in. Because the Neanderthals aren't just a chapter in prehistory, they're a mirror, a quiet, ancient reflection of who we were, and maybe who we still are. Let's start with what they left behind. Not in museums or textbooks, but inside us. If you're not of recent African descent, about 2% of your DNA is Neanderthal. That might not sound like much, but it's enough to shape little parts of your skin, your immune system, maybe even how you sleep. Some of those genes help your body respond to cold weather. Others strengthen your defenses against old pathogens. A few, less helpfully, seem linked to allergies, anxiety, or how your body processes sunlight. So yes, the reason you burn easily or sneeze in spring might trace back to a cave in Ice Age Europe. But that's only the surface. The deeper legacy is in what they represent, the proof that humanity was never one straight, clean line of progress. It was messy, overlapping, full of cousins, neighbors, and near misses. For most of our history, we weren't alone. We lived side by side with other versions of human beings, Neanderthals, Denisovans, maybe even smaller, stranger species we haven't met yet. That realization changes everything. The story of evolution isn't about one chosen species rising above all others. It's about connection, mixing, survival, and luck. The Neanderthals didn't vanish because they were inferior. They vanished because the world shifted just enough to favor us instead. Still, if you could look one in the eye, one of those short, muscular, broad-faced cousins, you might recognize something unsettlingly familiar. Their eyes weren't dull or animal-like. They were human. You'd see intelligence there, curiosity, maybe even kindness. And maybe they'd look back and think the same thing about you. Let's drift into what their world can still teach us. Because even though their bones are ancient, their lessons aren't. The first is about adaptation. The Neanderthals were built for an Ice Age world, dense, strong, efficient at retaining heat. But when that world started changing, those same traits turned against them. The Ice Age ended, forests spread, and big game animals began to disappear. They couldn't shift fast enough. Meanwhile, our ancestors, with lighter bodies and flexible habits, adapted. That's the quiet truth of evolution. It doesn't reward strength, it rewards flexibility, the ability to change, even when it's uncomfortable. Their second lesson is about empathy. The Neanderthals showed care. They looked after the injured, the weak, the elderly. They didn't need to do that for survival, it slowed them down, but they did it anyway. That choice, that simple act of compassion, is one of the most human things imaginable. And then, there's art. Those red handprints on cave walls in Spain. The simple beads made from shells. Those were acts of imagination. Proof that before we learned to write or build cities, we already felt the urge to leave something behind, to say, I was here. In that sense, the Neanderthals were the first to express something timeless, the need to matter. Of course, their story didn't end in triumph. Over time, their numbers dwindled. The climate grew harsher, their hunting grounds vanished, and small groups became smaller still. Isolation set in. Eventually, the fires in their caves went out one by one. By 40,000 years ago, the last Neanderthal was probably living somewhere in southern Spain, watching the coastline, the last of their kind. Maybe they still hunted. Maybe they still painted. Maybe they looked north and saw smoke from human camps in the distance. The horizon must have felt very empty. But extinction doesn't mean erasure. Every discovery, every bone, every gene reminds us that they didn't fail, they lived. For hundreds of thousands of years, they thrived in a world that would have broken us. And in the end, they didn't vanish. They merged. So, when you see those museum displays of stooped figures in furskins, don't see them, see us. Because the truth is, we are their continuation. And in some strange poetic way, maybe they live better through us than they ever did alone. Now, let's step quietly out of the caves. The air is cold again, but calm. The Ice Age winds have gone still. Somewhere deep beneath the soil, the bones of our cousins rest, surrounded by the echoes of fire and laughter. Above them, the stars shine just like they did 60,000 years ago. The same sky, the same quiet, the same long story still unfolding. So tonight, as you drift off, remember this: humanity was never a single species marching forward. It was a crowded family, full of strange, strong, beautiful relatives who walked beside us for a while. And if you ever feel a little out of place in the modern world, too quiet, too cautious, too built for colder times, well, maybe that's your Neanderthal showing. Sleep well, and give a little nod to the ancestors who made you possible.